Welcome back to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. Finding a will to go on, finding a reason for being. In this segment, I want to talk about really one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, but something that people don't often talk about that is applicable today because of what's in the news, but also because of the situation that many people have been facing over the past couple of years in virtually every country in the world. And really the sense of desperation that seems to be out there and that causes people a heightened sense of fear, and perhaps in some cases prompts certain people, the people that I direct this show to, people like you, to start asking themselves what it's all about. And whether or not this life that we're living, this existence among other human beings on this earth, is actually worth continuing. Now, perhaps I'll ask a question like this because, as I mentioned on previous segments of the show, which you can find at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, also you can find more information and other topics that I discuss. I tend to talk a little bit more at the shinsei-method.com, focused a little more on business, but it's very difficult to make that distinction. And in fact, there is no distinction between business and life, because ultimately business, work, family, they're all a part of your life. They all encompass your life. They're all certain aspects of your life. And the thing that makes that, or that makes all of those different areas of your life, the thing that gives it unification, the thing that unifies it, is you. And the thing that unifies you, at least this is the focus that I take on this show and at the shinsei-method.com, is to get you to a position where you are able to unify you, because you understand what you are. You understand what views, values, policies, practices, and procedures you hold. And you get a greater sense of you by doing that. And that's, again, why I call it the process of you. Shinsei is a method of self-development. It's a method of self-training. But it really is designed to get you to a position where you are going through that process of you, of thinking about yourself. And that's one of the first steps in finding the answer and the solution to that question that I started out this segment of the show, is finding a reason for being, finding a reason to go on. Because many people seem to take living for granted. They just assume that because you're on this earth, you're here, that life is worth living. Now, I don't want to use that phrase to imply, and this is unfortunately a logical conclusion, or really an irrational conclusion or illogical conclusion, that I found very easy to make, that when you ask that question, that is somehow implied in that question is it's not worth living. There is no implication for that question when I ask it, when I talk about it for purposes of this show and at the shinsei-method.com, and really any of the topics I talk about at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel. It really is a question, finding a reason for being, finding a reason to go on. Those are really questions that get you to think about what really is that reason. Why am I going on? Why am I taking life for granted? Is life really something that is worth living in and of itself? How do you get to that phase? How do you get to that level, that position, where you come to a realization that, yes, it's worth living? And I don't even have to ask that question, because I know just based on the way that I feel. Is that really how it goes? Well, in my experience, from the people that I've seen, and I've lived on this earth for 56 years, I have not seen very many people. In fact, I can't think of anybody who I could point to. I can think maybe perhaps a couple of priests that I've known who came pretty close. With all of the condemnation and criticism that many people in the Christian faith face, the only people that I can really say with any sense of confidence that when I looked at this person, I had the sense that he felt life is worth living, and he wanted to actually show me certain ways, of course, from the Christian perspective. But be that as it may, he wanted to show by how he carried himself and what he said, why he felt that why he wanted to live that in deed, not just in word. But that's very rare. I can think of maybe one, two people if I'm honest, and I want to be somewhat generous. I can't think of very many people that I can look at and say, yes, that person truly feels that life is worth living. You know, they'll say that. I've met many, many people that say that. They talk these, they make these kinds of grandiose phrases or these grandiose, claims like life is worth living, life is short, you have to really live and enjoy each moment. People will buy calendars, put them up on the wall, do all kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that if you truly believe it, but what I found is that people just put that on as window dressing. They don't really think about it very carefully. And certainly if they claim to believe it, they don't seem to demonstrate it in their actions. So for example, for me personally, things like compassion and trying to assist people has always been important. But I haven't found very many people for whom that has also been important. Sure, they'll talk about it. But I thought about this recently. I have been through many struggles in my life. In my first marriage, I had ended very poorly, unfortunately. I had difficulty at that time, and it took me really a lot of time to rebound. I've experienced depression and still dealing with that, maybe because I have faced depression and have come to that cliff, so to speak, and asked myself, why am I here? Why is it worth living? Because I have asked myself those questions, that I felt this kind of a question is good to ask at this time. Maybe if you haven't been to that, you are inclined not to ask yourself those kinds of questions, but that doesn't mean that the questions aren't important. They're very important, if for no other reason, to validate and confirm for yourself what you truly believe, if you truly believe that life is worth living. The reason that I think that that's a very important question to ask is because, as I said, for me, compassion, humanity, all the things that people often talk about have always been important to me. I can remember, just as an example, riding on the street. I was a passenger at the time. Someone else was driving. And I was living in Seattle at the time. Not considered a particularly violent place, but not considered to be a particularly safe place either. Maybe in the middle, as cities go in America. And we were driving along. I can remember this very conscientiously. Like it was yesterday. The person was driving along, and there was someone fighting on the road. And I've seen this more than once. People fighting. It's how a lot of people handle their difficulties. We saw this just recently. Someone said something that someone else didn't like, and he slapped them. I mean, people are often, they go from zero to I want to kill you in 10 seconds in this culture. Well, that in itself really prompts you to ask those kinds of questions. If that's life, if that is what characterizes what we face from a daily basis, if that is what humanity is, slapping people in the face when I don't like what they say, getting into fights with people because maybe they're wearing the wrong thing, they have a girlfriend or a friend that I don't like, or they're driving a car I don't, whatever the reason the people drop down to go to that kind of level. There's a lot of that going on, lots of wars in the world. There's currently a war going on in Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Europe. And there's been many wars throughout the world. It's not the only place, but there's a lot of places where there's wars and violence. Well, a lot of that seems to characterize life. That's the extreme case. I don't want to say that war characterizes all life. But if you think about it from your perspective and your own individual life, how many people actually extend you a helping hand? I mean a real helping hand when they don't really have an agenda to push, or they're not really trying to do anything, or they're not doing it for themselves. They want to make themselves feel good, so they may help you to do something in a very discreet and individual way. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who genuinely believe through deed that helping others and compassion is truly important. There are people like that in the world, of course. I just haven't met anyone like that. And I've lived 56 years, more than half my life. It's not that I haven't been looking. I read a lot. I listen to the news. So it's not even in my individual life that I'm limiting this to. I'm talking about in all of my experience. It's just not a very common thing, to be quite frank. So if that's humanity, humanity is not very kind. but you tend to believe in kindness. Humanity tends not to be very thrifty, but you tend to believe in thriftiness. Humanity tends not to be very reverent because they want to settle, in quotes, disputes through violence and other kinds of things, vandalism. I've experienced that too, and currently I'm in a question right now if someone is vandalizing my vehicle because they didn't like something that I did or a letter that I wrote or just didn't like something that I may have said or didn't like that I didn't speak to them one day. So their way to deal with that is to key your car or put a nail in your tire or do these kinds of things. Now, that's not very kind. Now, of course, in those individual situations, people can behave very differently, right? What they could do, if you do something as an individual that someone else doesn't like, they could extend kindness, extra kindness to you. That could be another alternative. I'm not saying they have to, but certainly they could. And they could continue to do that. Let's say, for example, they speak to you every day and you don't. They could continue to speak to you. Yeah, they don't get the reaction, and I'm not advocating this, but obviously that could be one thing that people do to continue to demonstrate compassion, humanity, even in the face of indifference and inhumanity. In fact, many people will argue that that's what humanity actually is, right? It's when you extend humanity in the face of inhumanity to demonstrate or by lead by example, in other words. You've heard that numerous times, I'm sure. Lead by example. Well, that's one way that people could lead by example. What I've found is that what people typically do, if you do something that they don't like, they respond in kind, and then they'll do something you don't like. Or they'll do something to, quote, get back at you. I've had people say that to me. I just wanted to get back at you. This is the way that people interact, and this is typically what they do. You say something they don't like, and then they do something in return that's just as bad or worse. And then this becomes what characterizes humanity. It becomes what characterizes interhuman interaction. Now, if that is what characterizes humanity and human interaction, why is life worth living? Is life really worth living if that's what characterizes life? Well, it's a very difficult question I have found, and I really, to be quite honest, I haven't found a concrete answer to that. I have found that, yes, there are periods where life is worth living. You feel that in yourself. Maybe for me, it's after a good exercise program or a good training program in self-defense or martial arts. Typically after that, maybe hiking, maybe doing other kinds of things in the outdoors, something that is challenging my ability to maintain a certain focus or a certain control. Photography tends to do that, holding the camera, being able to focus in on a flower, for example. For me personally, when I tend to do those kinds of things, that's when I feel afterwards or during life is worth living. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's those series of discrete events in your life that give you a great amount of joy, and that really would characterize life for you. I'm not saying that that's the way to look at life. You have to make your own determination, but what I am saying is it's a very important question to ask yourself, because I have found that it's very important not to just take that for granted. And here's the reason why. If you're a person like me who believes in compassion, humanity, tenderness, thriftiness, kindness, and you're in many social situations, and I've described a few already, where people are not. I just wanted to use as an example because I was the only one that did that. And that's typically what happens. I'll extend, in my previous years, I would extend a kindness to people. I can remember working in various jobs where I would say hello and goodbye to everyone before I left. And many people never responded. Or they would do and say things afterwards that showed that they didn't attribute any value to that kind of kindness that was extended to them. Maybe they yelled at me, for example. Rather than if I did something that they didn't like or they misunderstood something, they come to me and talk to me and say to themselves, this person speaks to me on a daily basis. He seems like a relatively decent person, decent chap, as some people might say, maybe in Great Britain, a decent chap. Let's see if I can talk to him and find out if we can reach an understanding. Most people don't do that. They just respond in a very impulsive, and a way that makes them or gives them immediate gratification. That becomes really the way of the world. So if you're a person that wants to extend a certain level of compassion and humanity, even when very few other people are doing that, it prompts you to ask that question, is life worth living? I have found. Because ultimately, and this is what I wanted to highlight in this segment of the show, it really is the point of this segment of the show, and really the point of the Shinsei method. You're very often in many social settings where if you are striving toward a constructive approach to reality, a constructive life goal, constructive values, you're very often at odds in many social settings. So you have to come to grips with that at some level, because if you don't, it can prompt you to start doubting those values, to start doubting yourself. And then that becomes the basis for inner weakness, not inner strength. It becomes the basis for inner imbalance, not inner balance. There's three pillars of individuality, well-being, and profitability. It becomes the basis for self-doubt, not self-trust. And as you see, this is why I developed the Shinsei method to be the contrary to all of the things that you tend to get, the kind of training you tend to get in many social settings. Not just indirectly if you're going through school or if you're in training programs, work training programs, other kinds of training programs, self-development programs. Not just there, but indirectly in your work settings or in your family settings where perhaps people extend indifference to these kind of values. That's a form of discouragement. That's a form of training, in a sense, in a different direction. That's often the kind of training you get to suppress those good values, to suppress that good compassion. I have often made the observation, for example, with babies, how babies, no matter who the baby is and no matter what they ultimately grow up to be, when they begin, they often have that natural curiosity where they want to understand, and you can see this when they're very young. They want to grasp out. They want to reach out. They want to understand. They're striving to speak, to communicate. They're striving to establish that connection. That's quite natural. But what happens very often from parents and then other kinds of people or other friends, perhaps, colleagues, relatives, they start to really destroy that reaching out in many ways. And then people, as they get older, that stuff seems to just disappear. People have no interest in learning anything outside of their own little box. Now, again, if you're a person that's not like that, of course, when we talk about anything on this show and at theshinseimethod.com, I've often talked about how one of the bases for the Shinsei method was the scientific method. Well, one of the bases for science itself is this desire to understand, this desire to learn, that same desire that the baby has. It continues in scientific inquiry. Well, of course, scientific inquiry is one of the best examples of progress, of development, of advancement, in a sense, of learning, of erudition, of understanding. All these principles that I talk about on the show and at theshinseimethod.com is built into the scientific method. So what does that tell you? The conclusion is that if you want to learn and grow and advance and progress, it's a good idea to follow what science does, that scientific method. Well, one of the bases for that is never destroying your desire to learn, to understand, to reach out, to extend. These are some of the most important elements of life. If you get rid of those elements of life, it will prompt you to ask, I have found, that question. Then what makes life worth living? The only concrete answer I've been able to extend for myself, and I extend it to you, I'm not saying that this is the end-all, the be-all, end-all answer, but it's the only one that I have found, and this is one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method, is value. Value is what gives life meaning. For me, I have found, value is what makes life worth living, ultimately. That value, that individual value that you strive for yourself and that you understand for yourself. But you're not going to be able to say to yourself and to understand what that value is if you don't think about it. That's, again, why I developed the Shinsei method. Analyze those key terms, define those terms in an individually suitable way, act on those terms, reevaluate, repeat. That becomes the process of Shinsei. That becomes a process of development. And of course, again, that becomes a process of you. But you're not going to get to that level of you, that understanding of you, that recognition of you, that self-trust of you, that self-belief in you, if you don't understand what you is in this case. And going through that process of self-analysis and self-awareness is really what it's all about. So those two questions, finding the reason for being and finding a reason to go on, are very valid and valuable. And they're important to ask yourself, if not once, on an ongoing basis, to reconfirm it for yourself. So that when you are faced with whatever the situation may be, social settings, crisis, difficulties, discouragement, at least you have value for yourself that you can hold on to, that sense of value in yourself, that you can grasp and really give you a sense that, yes, life is there. This is this reason, at least, for being. This is the reason to go on, this value. And it may not be very popular. You may not see many people talking about it. Maybe many people don't have much of an interest in it. But that doesn't mean to get rid of value. It just means that value is really your own personal anchor. And that's as much as you can really hope for, I have found. And if you get anything above that, I would say consider yourself lucky. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other relevant topics to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.